Welcome back. I'm so glad you're back with me today, and we can talk about some more of the Jewish people. We've been talking about Jacob's sons, then we talked about the desert habitat. Now I want to talk to you about Israel's kings, and sometimes we kind of think, well, how does that all connect? I don't know. It just is all in the Bible, so I guess it connects. But the point is, did God want Israel to have a king? Did he? I don't think he did, because you see, he wanted to be their king. He wanted to be their high priest. He wanted to come and dwell amongst them. However, we will see that he made a provision for them when they did choose a king, because he knew them. You know, God knows everything. There's no surprises with him. I mean, sometimes we're surprised, but he's not surprised. He knew the day would come when they would want a king, and so he set out specific provisions, and we're going to get into that in a minute. What I wanted to do was just talk about Israel's kings, the good, the bad, and the hideous. Some of them were horrible. Deuteronomy 17, we see the instructions for the king. He said to Moses, to the people, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. I mean, want to be just like everybody else. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. You know what? If we read the Constitution of the United States, it sounds very similar to that. We knew God knew from the very beginning that his people, his chosen people, the people he chose, the least of them all, would reject him. It wasn't because they didn't want him. It was more likely because they were afraid of him, and fear makes us do stupid things. You know, we do. We get into panic situations sometimes, and we shoot ourselves in the foot. It's really silly, and that's what Israel did. So, what was the provision? God would choose the king. He had to be one of them. He had to be Jewish. He could not be a foreigner, someone born in another land. Interesting, isn't it? That's pretty simple. God chose the king. The next two verses are specific about the rules for the king personally. They are things, the do's and the don'ts, if you will. Deuteronomy 17, verses 16 and 17. Moreover, he, the king, shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives, for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. It doesn't take a long time to figure out these rules or laws that kings, men who are in elevated positions, are going to adhere to them for very long. They just can't do it. From the very beginning, Israel's kings get into trouble. Think of it. Saul, usurping the authority of the priest and the prophet. David with Bathsheba. Solomon and his many wives and thousands of horses. For some reasons, it's just hard. It's really hard for men to keep it together, to be obedient to God. Look at Congress. The United States Congress. Think of how many congressmen we've had that go to Congress, barely enough money to survive on after they've had their campaign indebtedness. They go there, they sleep on a cot in their offices, and the next thing you know, they're living in mansions and they're multimillionaires. How does that happen? It isn't on the congressional salary. So, shouldn't have said that, should I? We don't always know it at the time, but history, often long after the fact, has a way of revealing behind-the-scene activity with our leaders, as it did with the leaders of Israel. We can look at our history books. Well, they're changing our history books now. But our history has some really dark sides to some of the things that our kings, i.e. our presidents, have done. Deuteronomy 17, 18, 20 says, now it shall come about when he, the king, sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest. What is this law? It's the Torah, the first 5 books of our Bible. It is the law. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in the kingdom in the midst of Israel. Wonder how many kings did that. Just stop to think. Writing a copy of the Torah for yourself. We're going to assume at this point they're scrolls. They've gotten past the having to do it on the stones, and they've gotten to parchment and ink and scrolls. And they're writing the law. They're copying it. They're not making new law. They're copying the Bible. They're copying Torah. Years ago, when my boys were young and they were in youth group at our church, the youth group, as a fundraiser, had these marathons where they would hand copy scripture. They did it on notebook paper. They did it at the church, and people could go and watch. And then they auctioned off the handwritten copy of scripture. Of course, it wasn't the entire Bible. I think it was a book. I don't remember exactly how much it was, but it was a fundraiser for the youth group. Well, imagine if the kings of Israel had taken the time. I know they didn't have 3-ring binders, and I know they didn't have lined papers, but had they have taken the time to copy the scrolls by hand, as they were instructed to do, and then read them daily, as they were instructed to do, then perhaps they wouldn't have gotten into some other trouble that they got into. But they didn't do that. Imagine what it would have been like imagine what it would be like today if the leader of a country was really observant of Torah. His heart's not lifted up above his countrymen. That's a huge statement. It's a huge thought. He would have to remain humble, which would cause him to be a caring person, not above them or us in any way, but one of them. Just because you become king doesn't mean that you're God. You're just another human being that was blessed. Sometimes we have to wonder how that could be. Look at the high esteem we hold our congressional leaders at. Look at that. And look at the big heads they get. I'm just thinking right now, and here it is, we're in 2018, and some of the stuff that's coming out of Congress now, the vitriol coming out of Congress, and you just want to walk up and slap them all and say, sit down and read the Bible, guys. You got to get it together. When we think about the rules and the requirements, we have to wonder what went wrong. Not only here in our own country, but what went wrong with Israel's kings. Why did they get so far away from what they were supposed to do? Throughout the book of Judges, which precedes the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, we see where the general populace goes up and down in their servitude of God. We had judges. Israel had judges. They had some good judges, but they had some bad judges. So Israel would have a judge after Joshua. They would have a judge, and he'd be a really good judge, and Israel would get her act together, and they'd be wonderful and holy and righteous. And then the judge would die, and then downhill they would go, and they would get into sin and corruption, and they would get attacked from all sides, from other nations, and they would be at war and be on the verge of being annihilated. And the people would cry out to God, and God would send them a judge, and the good judge would come, and he would get them out of the trouble again. And it went on and on and on. Cyclical. God, as I said earlier, doesn't like chaos, and he doesn't like confusion. He likes clarity. Israel was suffering because their own actions again and again, and finally they cry out for a king. And Samuel was the priest and prophet at the time. He was old. He had appointed his own 2 sons to be priests, and they were corrupt, just as corrupt as they could be. They took bribery. They made the people give up things that wasn't theirs to make them do. And the people finally said, hey, we want a king. We want a king to judge us. And Samuel didn't think it was a good idea. Samuel goes to God and he talks to him about it. And I imagine he's quite surprised when God tells him, Just do it. They want a king? Give them a king. They didn't reject you, Samuel. They rejected me, the Father. They rejected me, the Creator. So just give them their king and let's see how it plays out. And all I wanted from them was that they would love me and obey me. And isn't that what we want from our children? That they would love us and obey us? Comes a point when they are adults and we don't particularly expect them to obey us anymore, although every now and then I have to whack one of my boys upside the head. 1 Samuel 8:8 says, like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, and that they have forsaken me and served other gods. So they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them. Okay, God says they can have their king, but you need to warn them what they're getting themselves into. And Samuel goes back to the people and he warns them about it. And he says, he, the king, will take your sons and place them in his military and in his service. He, the king, will have to raise money for horses and chariots for an army. Guess where that money's coming from? You. He, the king, will put people in his service as servants to plow, to reap the harvest, and to make weapons. That's you. And he, the king, will take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers and probably concubines too. And he, the king, will take the best of your fields and your vineyards for his officers and his servants. Kind of a form of eminent domain. He will take 1/10 of your flock, and you and yourselves will become his servants. The people refused to listen to Samuel and said, no, we want a king so we can be like all the nations around us. Oh my gosh, all the nations around us? Really? You know, we look at the situation here in America right now. People are trying to get into our country and we're trying to keep them out and bring them in legally and righteously. And it's chaos. And we don't want to be like the other nations around us, do we? Hope not. Some people think we should be like that. But Israel was surrounded by bad kingships, bad kings that worshipped idols, bad countries that worshipped idols, and they wanted to be like them. They wanted to assimilate. They didn't want to be different. I know none of us wants to be different, but I kind of like being different. I know. Sometimes it'd be nice if I wasn't so different, but you know, I have some friends who love to be copied. Everything they do, they want their friends to do exactly the same. I'm kind of like, get your own idea. You know, this is my idea. Get your idea. I don't mind sharing and I don't mind obeying and being with people, but I don't want to be just like everyone else. If God wanted us all to be the same, he would have made us all of us have the same color skin, the same color eyes, same color hair. It would have been a really boring world, wouldn't it? He didn't want that. He didn't want us to assimilate. He wanted each of us to have a culture that was rich and beautiful. And he wanted us to share those cultures with each other, but not necessarily assimilate. I know as we have traveled to and from Israel so many times by the grace of God, I've picked up a lot from the Jewish people. I've learned some of their culture, learned some of their food, which we love, the artifacts, but yet I know who I am. And we bring those things home and we incorporate them into our homes, but we still have to have a solid understanding who we are. Well, Israel didn't want to do that anymore. They wanted to be just like everybody else. The first king was Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, Saul was a handsome man. He was taller than most of his kinsmen. He was at least a head taller than most of Israel. If you remember, Saul's father, donkeys got lost and they wandered away, and Saul was sent out looking for them, and he's gone for several days, and he decided to go to inquire of the man of God, of Samuel, and to ask him if he had any concept of where these donkeys were. Well, God had sent Samuel there to meet with him. In 1 Samuel, verse 9 to 16, God said, about this time tomorrow, I will send you, he's talking to Samuel, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. And you shall anoint him to be the prince over my people Israel. And he shall deliver my people from the land of the Philistines, for I have regarded my people, because their cry has come to me. Isn't that gracious? They've rejected God, and yet he's still taking care of them. When Samuel saw Saul, God had reaffirmed to him that this was the man he had chosen to be Israel's king. They spent some time together, they talked, they ate a meal or two, and Saul even stayed in the same location as Samuel. The next morning, the deed was gone. Saul was king. 1 Samuel 10:1 says, Then Samuel took the flask of oil, poured it on his head, on the head of Saul, kissed him, and said, Has not the Lord anointed you a ruler over his inheritance? Samuel then began to outline to Saul what was going to happen next. The most important thing Samuel told him was what would happen when he, Saul, encountered a bunch of prophets on his way home. He said, You would join them in prophesying. He said in 1 Samuel 10, verses 6 and 7, Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you mightily, and you shall prophesy with him and be changed into another man. And it shall be when these signs come to you, do for yourself what the occasion requires, for it is God with you. So the announcements came, 1 Samuel 10, verses 18 through 19. Samuel begins to tell the people about what was going to happen. He summarized it. He said, God brought you out of Egypt. Always we remember God bringing the Jews out of Egypt. That's almost every statement. God brought you out of Egypt, out of slavery, into freedom. God delivered you from the Egyptians. God delivered you from the power of the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today, you've rejected that one true God that delivers you from all your calamities and distresses, and you've cried out for a king. Then to solidify the choice and prove it to the people, they brought all the tribes for the choosing. I mean, now it's kind of like almost like a play that they're doing. It's already a done deal, but now they're acting it out. So he says, by lot, they chose the tribe of Benjamin. By lot, they chose the family of the Metrite. By lot, they chose the king, Saul, son of Kish. But when they looked around for him, they couldn't find him because he was hiding behind the luggage. Maybe it hit him, finally hit him. What a huge, huge responsibility he had been just handed. And God pointed him out, and the people pulled him forward. Then Samuel said, Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there's no one like him among all the people. So all the people shouted and sang, Long live the king. And with that, Israel had their first king, and everyone went home, including Saul. He went back to what he was doing before. I mean, there was no reason not to at this point. And then the Ammonites attacked Jabesh Gilead of Israel. And Jabesh Gilead went to King Saul asking for help. Now, if you remember, Jabesh Gilead is the group of people that came to Joshua under a wrong ploy. But Joshua, before he realized who they were, he pledged to take care of them and protect them forever. And so now they're being attacked. So they go to Saul, who's the newly appointed king, and say, help us, help us. And Saul had actually been working in the fields. He was still humble, just like everyone else. When he came in, he sees the people weeping, and he asks what's going on, and then he gets mad. And the Spirit of God came up on him, and he became very angry. And he summons an army. Now, when he did it, he chopped something up and sent it out and said, y'all better come be a part of this army, or we'll chop you up like this animal. And he must have had a good military mind, because he divided the army into 3 groups. 3? That's a military maneuver. And they attacked the Ammonites before the first watch, or at the first watch, which is from 10 o'clock at night to 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometime in that time frame, it's a 4-hour time frame. Sometime in that time frame, they came upon the Ammonites who were asleep, and they attacked them, coming from 3 different directions. And they killed them all. A few of them managed to survive, but there were no 2 left together, and they ran away. And all of a sudden, Israel now has a king, of their first king, their first battle, and their first win. And the soldiers were exuberant. in their wind. They wanted to kill any man who did not want to stand with Saul, which indicates that there was some resistance to his kingship. But Saul said no. He's still humble. He said, no, this is a day of celebration. No one dies. Let's go to Gilgal. So what happens at Gilgal? This is where Samuel instructed Saul to go right after he had been anointed king. Go there and wait. I will come down there and I will offer burnt offerings and sacrifices. Gilgal was one of the places where Samuel judged, so it had already been established as one of the seats of government. So all the people went to Gilgal. Now, it wasn't all millions of them, but a bunch of them. 1 Samuel 11:15 says, and all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before them. But before the Lord in Gilgal, there they also offered sacrifices, peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. They've had reason to celebrate. They've had a war, they won the war, everything's looking good in the neighborhood, and they're happy. What a day of rejoicing that was. If only Saul had stayed the same. But as we said a while ago, with almost all men, once they get into that seat of power and authority, they get corrupted by it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You know that saying. Not only do they become stronger in many ways, but sometimes they become as paranoid as Saul did. We know of Saul's escapades, of his son Jonathan, how he loved his father, but he also loved David, who would be the first king of Judah and then united Israel, and also the last king of united Israel. Saul couldn't keep his act together to the point that God said he was sorry that he made Saul king. I mean, do you ever think that God is sorry about something he gave us or granted us? I hope not. That would be really sad. He was angry that Saul had not followed his commandments, specifically the commandment to wipe out Amalek and utterly destroy everything, material possessions, animals, men, women, children, everything. Nothing was to be left. That didn't happen. What did happen was Saul spared King Agag, the king of the Amalekites. They didn't kill all the sheep, but they chose to keep them for sacrificing. Now, a sacrifice that doesn't belong to you is not a sacrifice. A sacrifice, giving up something that you don't own, is not giving up anything. So what's the deal here? Saul tried to talk his way out of the judgment that was coming on him, but Samuel wouldn't hear of it. Samuel himself, he was so angry. And he hacked Agag to death. Agag, when he summons Agag in before him, when Samuel summons him in, he was really, floating through the neighborhood thinking he had managed to make things good for himself. Although he'd been overthrown as king, he still was alive and everything was good and his family was alive and it was good. Until he saw Samuel, and Samuel said, you're an evil man and you're going to die. And he killed him right there, hacked him to death with Saul's sword. Saul was terrified. As Samuel was leaving, Saul grabbed Samuel's cloak. It's like, wow, whipped it, pulled it. And he said, don't do this, don't do this. And Samuel turned around and told him, just as you've torn my cloak today, so will God tear this kingdom out of your hands. That's quite a prophecy. And that's what happened. Saul's life didn't end happily. If you remember, he became insanely jealous of David. And we're going to get into that story in the next teaching. But Saul, he was so paranoid that when David, his little David from Bethlehem, when he came into Saul's presence, it started off good. But in no time, jealousy took over. Jealousy is a destroyer. You know what? I've seen it happen. I've had people jealous of me and it's ruined relationships and it's broken my heart. Jealousy is a destroyer. It's one of the most evil things there is. And Saul was paranoid, and he was jealous of David because the women would sing, Saul killed his thousands, David killed his 10,000. So I want to get on that next lesson. But the tragedy and the paranoia, the intrigue, the hostility, the deception, all became part of Saul's kingship. He didn't listen to the instructions to make himself a copy of the Torah and to read it every day. I don't know if he ever even made the copy. He started off an humble, good man, and he ended on a hillside in northern Israel when he was killed in a battle, and his body, his head was chopped off, and his body was hung on the walls of Bet Shean. Tragic ending to something that should have been so good and so pure, and it wasn't. A thing that was pure that came out of Saul was his son Jonathan, and the love relationship he had for David. It was not a strange relationship. It was a good relationship, a holy and pure relationship. You know, sometimes we can love our brothers or our sisters more than our natural, our friends, more than our natural brothers and sisters, because we're knitted together in the spirit and in the soul. And Jonathan and David were knitted together in their souls. God appointed them to be brothers to each other in the spirit realm. And so I'm going to stop today with this story about Israel's kings, and we'll get into it with some more as the next teaching opens up. But I just want to say to you, think about this, and remember, Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And oh yeah, here's my book. Think about this. It's called Valor. This is the story of Abigail, one of David's wives. Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim.